We acknowledge that we are streaming to you today from the traditional lands of the Kaurna people. We respect their spiritual relationship with their country.
We also acknowledge the Kaurna people as the traditional custodians of the Adelaide region, and we respect that their cultural and heritage beliefs are still as important to the living Kaurna people today.
We extend that respect to all First Nations people watching and sharing with us today. Hi, I'm Sam.
And I'm Lee.
And we are moderators at MOD. MOD is the Museum of Discovery. We are a future-focused museum that explores art, science, and innovation.
And MOD TV is the latest venture for MOD, with live content streaming directly to your screens 4 days a week. Here at MOD TV, we'll be engaging with the themes of connection, well-being, and disruption, looking deeper into our exhibits, hosting games, and much more.
Our current online exhibition at MOD is Life Interrupted, where we are exploring well-being and connectedness in a disrupted world. Today, we want to focus on disruption, and to help us do that, we're pleased to welcome Connal Lee.
Dr Connal Lee is a philosopher and ethicist who has been researching pandemic ethics for the past 14 years. Connal's research analyses the moral requirements of individuals, collectives, and institutions to prepare for and respond to high-level emergencies involving infectious disease. Holding a PhD from Flinders University and a Master's in Applied Ethics from the Norwegian University of Science and Technology.
Connal has lectured in universities across Australia and delivered both national and international conference papers on pandemic ethics, pleasure and health, art and connectedness, and the value of utopian thinking in, there's a few pop-ups coming up, in political philosophy. Please welcome Connal Lee. Hi, Connal. And if anyone watching has any comments or questions for Connal, please put them up in the Twitch stream chat and we'll try and get them to the talk today. Hi, Connal. It's a pleasure to have you joining us for MOD TV today and talk about disruption. And it seems like your work is very topical at the moment and your areas of research. Can you tell us a little bit more about the field of pandemic ethics and how it relates to today's topic of disruption?
Yeah, sure. So I've been looking at pandemic ethics now for 13, 14 years, going back to around 2006 when I first got interested in this area. So it was after the SARS epidemic in 2003. A lot of philosophical and ethical interest grew around this area. The World Health Organization told every nation that they should be planning for the inevitabilities of a pandemic. And something interesting that emerged from that was this idea that ethics should be embedded into pandemic planning. And the more that I delved into this, the more intrigued and interesting it became, because the issues were, so vast. We had to sort of look at how organized societies are to prepare for emergencies like this, all the way down to how would we distribute scarce resources in the event that there wasn't enough for everybody. And it became these really juicy ethical questions. And the more I peeled it back, it was a little bit like an onion. The more I peeled it back, the more it kind of made my eyes water. And we found that it was stuff that had been discussed throughout, for the last 2,000 years of philosophy. What do we want a good life to look like? And how do we respond to emergencies at the same time as ensuring that these things that we value, remain constant, if you will.
Yeah, definitely. It's kind of times of crisis sometimes show up those areas where society might be missing a few things, or maybe where society is really good at a few things. So it's interesting, it kind of forces this conversation. So it's interesting, that research started sort of since SARS. And but now is being applied. Is it being applied at the moment, do you think?
Well, I mean, on the one hand, it's kind of interesting that something I've been working on for so long has now become topical and is an event that's happening right now. For so long I was running around like the crazy person saying, there's a pandemic coming, we need to prepare, I wrote a paper for The Conversation back in 2016, 2017 about we need to start thinking about how we would allocate, say, for example, scarce vaccines. And it didn't get anywhere near as many hits reader-wise as the more recent paper that I did since the pandemic began. So I used to sort of tell people as an in to getting them to sort of understand what it is that I did, that it was a little bit like, what's a just response to the zombie apocalypse? How should we respond in the event that there was some sort of infectious disease that made people a threat to other people? And how might we, you know, are we okay in just being self-interested, or should we be working together? These kind of really fundamental questions. And now I think that people are starting to really get their heads around what a pandemic involves. And, you know, I think it just blows out that conversation a bit more. So it'll be interesting to see what happens over the coming months and years in the field of pandemic ethics, especially if, you know, when we roll out vaccines, you know, the conversations that we start having about allocating those potentially scarce resources on a global scale, assuming we can get a vaccine, of course.
Well, now that so you've done all this research, you've been looking at this for so many years, and now it's almost like, you know, your predictions have come true. For some people, that would be how they're perceiving it. They're like, oh, Connal was right all along. But now that we're in the midst of it, what are you finding is the most challenging aspect now?
I really did hope that when I was writing my PhD that I was writing the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. You know, that this would come along and everyone would come rushing and grab my, you know, my PhD and go through it. And, you know, I think that this was some great, you know, path forward. But, you know, it's only one sort of piece of the puzzle, and it's that philosophical, ethical lens that, you know, looking at what we would want society to be optimally organized in order to deal with an emergency. So one of the things that really emerged in terms of you know, ethical perspectives on this was that not only could we have really high rates of death and, you know, nasty illness and hospitals being pushed to maximize, you know, to breaking point potentially, but a pandemic could raise serious questions of justice and could make inequalities worse, and it could make injustices worse. So it could be catastrophic, not only from the point of view of loss of life, but catastrophic from the point of view of justice. So it was really about looking at how well society protects itself against, you know, misfortune and potentially, you know, wrongdoing. In the case of, you know, people perhaps flouting social distancing rules or things like this. So it's about, you know, looking at what we might call a just society, theoretically, and trying to get there before something like a pandemic comes along, so that we can sort of mitigate those kind of issues, so that, you know, inequalities don't blow out, that, you know, people who are perhaps at the bottom end don't end up, you know, significantly worse off, you know, for example.
Yeah, definitely. And it is, I'd never, besides the board game, I'd never really even contemplated a pandemic kind of coming along to this scale. And it all seems really complicated to me. But what makes this more complicated than you thought through all your research, and now it's here? What's most complicated about it?
I mean, there's so many different sort of, you know, features of it that it's even with all the sort of philosophical understanding or ethical discussion that we can have, there's still this fear in the face of uncertainty. We don't really know what's going to happen in Australia, or we don't really know what's going to happen elsewhere. It's quite scary when you look, for example, at what's happening in the US. I mean, initially it was kind of nice when we first realized, when we started to have to socially distance, how difficult that was. That we're so used to being connected with one another, that, you know, we're so used to being in close proximity as social animals. And maybe there were some struggles early on with people sort of getting that we need to maintain that 1.5, perhaps even optimally around about 2 meters from each other. So it was kind of nice that we're so used to being connected to each other. But on the other hand, it was kind of scary because, you know, it was almost like we could all get very seriously ill, and perhaps, you know, the outcomes could be quite bad as a result of that connection that we would think is just inherently good, you know.
And what do you hope people in society take away from your work? How's it being used at the moment, and what would you like to see it be used, or is it being used in a way that is great?
Well, I think that something that ethics should be doing an ethicist should be doing is creating the space for potentially uncomfortable or challenging conversations about things. I don't think philosophers should be shying away from having the, potentially quite challenging conversations, particularly when we think about things like how we would allocate scarce resources, which I think is a really big question that we need to look at. So I'd like my work to be maybe a catalyst for potentially having those uncomfortable conversations and not being, allowing ourselves to be pushed to polar ends, to actually kind of meet and to negotiate the grey areas that exist when we talk about these things. But also it can be, philosophy is, in a sense, it's sort of a linguistic game, if you will. So you can sort of have fun with some of the arguments. You can kind of see the ways into understanding the questions that are worth asking during a time like this. So, as an example, something I'll always often get my students to think about with allocating scarce resources, I might ask them, if you had one vaccine, would you give it to, say, Donald Trump, or would you give it to Justin Bieber? And I would get them to have a debate about, well, we've only got one, we can only rescue one person. Who would we rescue, assuming that in that case that we should at least rescue one of them? Who would we give it to and why? And then we start to open up a conversation about, things that can be quite challenging, like age-based rationing. Should we give it to the younger person over the older person? Should we give it to the person that yields the greatest social value? Is that something that can we have a conversation about social value in a pluralistic country like Australia, where we have so many different notions of what's good and what's valuable? If we were giving our resources to the most socially valuable, does that mean it's going to go to footballers, or is it going to go to artists? Are the political leaders going to make sure they get theirs first? These kind of things. So the
philosophers, we'd make sure philosophers got it, yeah?
I would hope so. I would hope that there would be, of course, we need to, talk about whether or not social value is important. So I think that for the world of the future does need philosophers. I think we are important. We should get our place on the mothership. But of course we need, a nice breadth of people in that case, don't we?
Certainly. And you've maybe have covered it a little bit, but and it might not be an appropriate question, but what is there, and what is the key question that we should be asking now and into the future? Is there a key question?
Yeah, I think we need to think about, I think it's been interesting to see how our humanity's been tested. In some respects, it's been disappointing to see how some of our responses. It's also been very encouraging to see other aspects of humanity's response. I think a big question going forward is to really ask, what sort of society do we want to be? What sort of people do we want to be? In a sense, there's an opportunity here to really recast the debate about what society should look like. When we see things like job seeker and job keeper, for example, and we see this creation of tiers of unemployed people who are on different sorts of payments. Is this really the way that is this really the best response? Should we be creating almost inequalities within our welfare system? Do we need to rethink the nature of our welfare system? Do we need to rethink, our institutions a little bit? Are we, organized in the way that we should be? So there's the potential, I think, for us to ask, are we on the right path in terms of moving towards a more just society and a more equal society?
Yeah. I particularly like one of the titles of one of the papers that you delivered on art and connectedness and the value of utopian thinking in political philosophy. Would you care to reflect on how that may apply in our current climate?
Yeah, well, so utopian thinking is a sort of a theoretical device. It's kind of, and I used this in my PhD, which was to basically sketch out what we think a just society would look like before we start actually tackling questions of injustice in the in the actual real world. So the idea is that unless we have a picture, a normative picture of what the world ought to look like, we can't really start criticizing things about how the world is. Now that might, it sounds all good and well. The problem is that if we are committed to utopian thinking, we might think of it being a little bit like Paradise Island. And no one's ever been there. And we don't really know how to get there. And every move that we make is geared towards getting us to Paradise Island, which might mean that in the meantime, we don't do certain things to actually make life better for certain people, if they don't set us on the right path. So it becomes sort of a question of, as I was saying before, what sort of society do we want to be? What sort of path do we want to go down? And is it about us all setting sail for Paradise Island? Or is it about just, doing what we can here and now to make life, better for everyone? Yeah.
So with all that, like getting to Paradise Island, because I can't help but being like, at the end of this, but we have to get to the end of it. So how do you think this is all going to play out over the next few months? Is there anything we should be thinking about post COVID-19 disruption?
It's very unclear. I've heard it said in recent days that this might be just another disease that's going to fit into the bundle of diseases that humanity has to live with. It might be something that mutates season to season, like influenza, or it might be something that we can't eradicate, in the near term. So it's yeah, so it's probably going to be an ongoing thing potentially, at least for a while yet. Assuming, of course, that we don't develop a vaccine, that we could be looking at a more serious, this discussion around phases of the emergency and how it might bundle together, even with seasonal flu and things like that. So it's difficult to sort of, look into the crystal ball and to say what's going to happen. I think that philosophically, a lot of the questions that we've been asking for even since the ancient Greeks remain relevant to continue asking, even as we negotiate these kind of disruptions and these emergencies. To not sort of think that discussions of a just society, for example, that they should just be put aside for now. I think they could be quite central. And there's other emergencies that were in place prior to all of this, and we look at climate change and things like this that we need to tackle as well. So I would hope that philosophy and ethics could actually offer a space for that conversation to happen, where we start talking about how do we need to build new institutions to cope with these new problems that we're seeing in the 20s.
Yeah, and it's so true as well. It's almost like a real life trolley problem. Like in Italy, they're like, who do we save? And that's real now. It's like, do we save the elderly, or do we, give all the resources to the younger people? So, it's talking about the just society. Are you seeing our values and thoughts about what justice is and what is just changing through the pandemic as well? Do you see anything on that level kind of shifting now that we're in that kind of situation?
Yeah, I think something that was actually kind of interesting to me was prior to the pandemic. I was skeptical that we would be able to express a sense of solidarity with all groups within society. There was some evidence that back in 2009, during the so-called swine flu epidemic, that in Canada they tried to roll out some vaccines for prisoners as a priority to protect the people in correctional facilities who, due to overcrowding, were profoundly vulnerable. And the public weren't happy about this. They thought, that point I made before, our social value, they thought that they didn't have social value, and they didn't think that prisoners deserved these resources. That it was an unjust decision to do this, and the government backtracked and actually wound back the policy. And I expected similar sorts of things to happen. There was also people weren't happy about people with obesity and smokers also getting priority treatment. You know, they were more likely to suffer as a result of infection, but people thought, you know, well, these people, they deserve their plight. It's unfair to give it to them because they've made their bed and they should lie in it. And I was concerned we'd see those sorts of you know, points being made. But I've been pleasantly surprised to see, you know, good discussions around whether, you know, how we might respond to correctional health. To even think about, you know, how our correctional health system is run. Why are people profoundly vulnerable? Why are we running at almost, you know, maximum capacity? You know, the relationship between correctional health and community health. They're not just quarantined in prisons. They're, you know, most people leave prison and they can bring with them nasty diseases as well. So I was concerned about things like stigmatization. And so far, I think it's been good to see that, you know, for the most part, there hasn't been these sorts of debates about deservingness. They have happened, but yeah, conceptually running deservingness together with what's fair is problematic. And that's something I think we could just, you know, could be discussed more as we go forward and talk about justice. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know this has been all encompassing, but are there any other ideas that you're exploring at the moment?
So just prior to the pandemic happening, I just published a paper with my my partner in crime, Sarah Northcott, who's a curator. We published a paper on art and connectedness. So our argument was about how community galleries, the mod, for example, as a gallery, create what we call sort of social capital in terms of connecting people. And one of the arguments we actually made in that paper was that when you have these social resources, when you build social capital prior to something like a pandemic, you kind of lay the groundwork that's necessary to create that, you know, that sense of solidarity that I mentioned earlier. So that sense of, you know, pulling together and seeing the threat that is at hand as something that threatens everybody, and that, you know, we shouldn't have a self-interested response. Although it was very disappointing to see all the people stockpiling toilet paper. It, you know, cuts, you know, in communities where there's more togetherness and more connectedness, we're more likely, hopefully, to share our vital resources, for example. That it might be a little bit harder to you know, take more than your fair share from people when you know those people by name, you know, for example. So, you know, we were looking at the ways in which art builds that social capital. And it's a big argument that's already happening in places like the UK, where they've got things like social prescribing, even where doctors will say that, you know, as part of your recovery, you should go to the gallery 3 times a week, take in this amount of pieces of art and things, which I think is really great. But yeah, it is this notion of connectedness that's really important. And if we have those sorts of things, we have those ties at a community level prior to an emergency, I think we stand a better chance of, you know, surviving that emergency, you know, together.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. It's definitely that kind of feeling going around as well.
For sure.
Now looking forward though, what's next for you? What comes now?
What comes now? It's a good question. I mean, in a lot of ways, prior to the pandemic, I was kind of like moving in a slightly different direction. It's hard because when you write a PhD on something, that sort of becomes your life's work. It's a bit hard, no matter what I've done since finishing that up in 2014. I just keep coming back to the ideas in it and seeing what I could have done better and seeing where the gaps were. You know, I mentioned, for example, solidarity a moment before. I barely touched that in my thesis. So I think there's always things you can revisit and look at, and we're going to get, you know, a plethora of empirical data as a result of this pandemic. But I mean, philosophically, for me, it's these bigger questions about justice, and I think that I'd like to continue to work, I suppose, towards questions about, you know, where do we want to go? I mean, I really like doing all the theoretical stuff with philosophy, but it's got to be stuff that we can, you know, actually use as well, that we can actually, you know, turn into policies potentially, or ground, you know, guidelines for global institutions and things like this.
And you mentioned earlier about that you were kind of pleasantly pleased to see that similar behaviours that maybe, you know, came up sort of just over 10 years ago hadn't re-emerged in this crisis, in this setting. And I wondered, do you have any thoughts on what might be contributing to that? What discussions we're having in society, or what influences we're having that has maybe changed that view slightly over those 10 years?
I mean, to be fair, it could be just my perspective on things. It could be the circles I move in, that we increasingly, we live in echo chambers of our own design as we live in our online worlds. We follow people on social media with who we agree. So in a sense, I might move in circles that kind of echo back that, you know, those kind of things that I want to say. The opposite could equally be true. And it is equally concerning to see, you know, the rise of certain perspectives as a result of the online world. So, I mean, there is always, you know, that your own perspective is kind of clouding how you're kind of viewing these things. But I'm honest that, you know, utopian thinking has a place. I think that we should be thinking about, are we moving on the right waves towards Paradise Island? I think that it's a nice way to think about things. It means that we can always be doing better. We can always be moving towards justice. It gives us a target. And if we do all that ideal theorizing, it gives us some principles that we can work from here and now. So despite some of the, you know, the awful death toll and things that we're seeing, I think there's still grounds for us to sort of remain optimistic and positive about how we can still continue to work towards justice, and that this pandemic is not going to wipe out humanity. It's not the zombie apocalypse. You know, we will go on, and we need to ask ourselves what we want that to look like, you know.
Yeah, certainly. And I guess if any, people are interested in finding out more, if they want to find out how to get that ticket to Paradise Island, or how to make their own little Paradise Island here, or just talk about all these ideas, where would you suggest that we start looking?
It's 2,000 years of philosophy that we can start looking at. I mean, there's by getting interested in these questions, I think, you know, if you just start searching for philosophical and ethical perspectives on these things, because it can be so easy to get bogged down in science that is hard to access. And in a lot of that sort of discussion around epidemiology and the nature of viruses and things like that, it's not really that accessible to people. Whereas what values we want to underpin our, you know, response, that's something we can all talk about. So we can inform ourselves by, you know, developing our ethical understanding and, you know, looking at, you know, I think if one thing that people can do is look at the value of Socratic questioning, you know, asking the right questions. You know, we don't need to come up with the answers, but we should be asking each other the right sorts of questions to get clarity and to challenge our assumptions, and to, you know, become self-aware and develop some self-knowledge. Yeah. So Google Socratic questioning. That's what I'd say. Do that.
Excellent. And we'll be posting links to your socials and some of your works in our chats as well. If people want to click on that, they'll see a little bit more of you too. But thank you so much, Connal. This has been, I could sit here and talk to you for hours, I think, but we only have half an hour, unfortunately. But thank you so much for coming onto our program this afternoon.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. It's been great. Cheers.
Well, Lee, I hope we asked the right questions today. A big part of our job, I think, is perhaps Socratic questioning and appropriate questioning. I think you did, but I am going to Google Socratic questioning, and I hope a link has gone up in the Twitch stream chat because I don't know how to spell Socratic, but yeah, there'll be a link there to Google that. Our next segment is we're going to jump over to Museum Shift, which is an RPG developed by our own moderators, Josh and Debbie.
Awesome. And if you can't see the next segment appear, just try refreshing your browser and our games should pop up for you.
Socratic is Socratic. It relates to Socrates. It all makes sense now. I Googled that while enjoying the stream of Museum Shift. Thanks so much for tuning in. It's been great chatting with our guest, Connal Lee, and checking on Museum Shift with Josh and Debbie. And thanks to the wonderful Samuel, Hen, Ben, Becky, Claudia, and Rachel all working behind the scenes today.
And we'll be back on tomorrow at 4 p.m. with another edition of Mod TV. But in the meantime, if you'd like to see more of what's happening here at Mod, you can head to our website, mod.org.au, or our Facebook and Instagram as well.
And now we're just going to jump straight back into a little bit more of Museum Shift.
Bye.